Hello. Today I'm going to talk about John Stuart Mill's book On Liberty. Or perhaps I should say Harriet and John Stuart Mill's book On Liberty. Because John Stuart Mill himself admits that this book was written jointly by himself and his wife Harriet. He says that practically every single sentence in the book was a result or a product of their joint endeavour. John Stuart Mill, by the way, was very much a feminist. He wrote a book about the subjugation of women. He was the first individual to propose that women should be given the right to vote. When he was a member of parliament, he moved an amendment to the effect that persons should be allowed to vote, and only relatively late in the process did the other one spot that persons could also mean women, and they stopped him in his tracks, and he was lampooned for the rest of his life and caricatured as Miss John Stuart Mill. But this idea that everybody should be given a right to have their say also permeates this wonderful little book that him and Harriet wrote together. The fundamental idea in this book is that everyone should be given their say. He says, in fact, we should have a system where eccentricity is rewarded. They say in the book that there is a relationship between genius in a society and eccentricity. The more odd we are, the more strange ideas we can bring to the table, the more likely we are that one of these ideas will actually be the right one. Now, he takes a complete shot, or they take a complete shot, at people who silence debate. At this time in history, we have seen governments around the world, 37 governments during the coronavirus, who have limited the freedom of speech. They say that if people actually can speak up, then it would be dangerous and there could be chaos. And they are assuming, all these governments, whether it's Viktor Orban in Hungary or the Chinese government or the government in Bolivia, that they are infallible. So Mill says that the idea of silence in discussion is always based on an assumption of, quote, infallibility. Now, it is fundamental, for a fundamental axiom, if you like, in Western political history and Western intellectual thought, that freedom is a spirit which does not know that it's always right. Western civilization, from Socrates' dialogues with other people through René Descartes, De omnibus dubitandum est, which means you ought to doubt everything, until John Stuart Mill, and beyond that, it's based on the assumption that nobody has complete knowledge of the truth, that we all have to learn, that we learn from mistakes. And the only way in which we can learn from mistakes is if every single idea gets an airing, that we're actually able to listen to all these debates. So therefore, fundamentally, a society can only progress if you allow it to have an open discussion of all the things that are there. Now, that also has implications. In this book, he also goes on to talk about how we can get the truth out, to have a political system that would enable or facilitate this airing of all the different ideas. He says it's necessary to have a party of reform and a party of stability, that you have that open debate in Parliament, that you have a system that ensures that minorities always have a say. And for that reason, in a book that is called Considerations on Representative Government, Mill suggests that we should have a system of proportional representation, so that minority groups always will be represented in Parliament. He was one of the very first people to write about proportional representation. He is afraid of and opposed to the tyranny of the majority, the system that we have in some ways in the United Kingdom and to a degree also in places like Australia, where we have one party in government that doesn't have to listen to the opposition. And when you don't have to listen to the opposition, you can get away with things. Whereas in a country where you have proportional representation, many different political parties, then the opposition party will always be there to criticize. Now, there's a wonderful Chinese saying that 3 stupid shoemakers no more than the wise man. It was an idea that was also proposed actually by another great writer, Aristotle, and we will get back to him in a subsequent episode. And he says the better meals are the ones that are prepared by many different people. We all bring different things to the table. Now that is the fundamental idea also in John Stuart Mill and Harriet Mills on liberty. It is a book that says that all debates should be out there, that we should have eccentric people so that we can get eccentric ideas out there. Not because they will always be right, but because occasionally, there will be nuggets of gold there. And if we silence opinion, we don't just silence opinion for those people who have uttered those opinions. It's not just bad for the people who are uttering the opinions. In fact, the whole of mankind, all human beings, will suffer for the fact that these ideas did not get an airing. Now, then you might say, well, shouldn't there be limits to this freedom of speech? Where do we draw the line? And again, in this very, very short book, Mill has an answer to that. If you're a philosopher, you would use a technical term which is called a reflective equilibrium, which is where you weigh up the pros and the cons, the high principles with the practical principles. And he says, in this book, he talks about what is known as the example of the corn dealer. And he says, well, you're allowed to say that capitalism is evil if you write it in a newspaper, if you write it pretty much anywhere else. But if you're standing in front of the corn dealer's house with a mob, with an angry mob, then you're not allowed to say it. So therefore, freedom of speech is contextual, but under normal circumstances, we are depriving ourselves of the truth, of progress, of liberty, of welfare, and indeed of happiness if we limit freedom of speech.